The 6th of June 1944, Normandy beaches, British soldiers landed with 50-year-old Lee-Enfield rifles. The German K98 Mauser was more modern, more accurate, more advanced, but when the war ended, British soldiers had tossed aside the captured Mausers they'd picked up. That epic. Why does a soldier reject a more modern weapon? Because staying alive matters more than specifications on paper. The Lee-Enfield story begins in the 1880s, when the British Army recognized they needed a repeating rifle using smokeless powder. Scottish-Canadian inventor James Paris Lee had designed a revolutionary detachable box magazine system. When combined with the rifling system developed by the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, the result was the magazine Lee-Enfield. After first seeing service in the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902, several iterations later, in 1907 the short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III emerged. The iconic SMLE would serve through 2 world wars and countless colonial conflicts. What kept this rifle going for nearly a century wasn't any single revolutionary feature, but rather a combination of practical design choices that prioritized what actually mattered in combat. The standard military thinking of the era emphasized long-range accuracy. European armies were obsessed with hitting targets at 800, 1,000, even 1,500 yards. The Germans particularly prided themselves on marksmanship, and their Mauser rifles reflected this philosophy with longer barrels and tighter manufacturing tolerances. The British took a different approach with the SMLE. They shortened the barrel to just 25.2 inches, making the rifle handier in trenches and vehicles. They accepted slightly reduced long-range accuracy, because their combat studies showed that most infantry engagements happened within 300 yards. This was heresy to European military theorists, but it proved prophetic when the reality of trench warfare set in after 1914. The rifle's rear-locking bolt design raised eyebrows amongst firearms experts. Most military rifles, including the Mauser, used a front-locking system where lugs near the chamber bore the pressure of firing. The Lee-Enfield's lugs sat at the rear of the bolt, which theoretically made it weaker and less accurate. Critics argued this design would never match the precision of a Mauser. They were right on the target range, but battlefields aren't target ranges, and the Lee-Enfield's design brought advantages that mattered more than shaving a few inches off group sizes at 600 yards. The longer bolt travel required by the rear-locking system actually made the rifle faster to cycle, and the action proved more forgiving of dirt and debris. By 1939, when Britain again found itself at war with Germany, the SMLE was theoretically obsolete, yet production ramped up instead of being phased out. Factories in Britain, India and Australia churned out millions more. British commanders weren't clinging to tradition. They knew something that looked good in an engineering manual didn't always translate to superiority in combat. The Lee-Enfield's action was specifically designed for speed. The bolt handle sat at a 60-degree angle rather than the 90 degrees found on most military rifles. This shorter bolt throw meant less movement between shots. Your hands stayed in a natural position without excessive wrist rotation. The rifle's rear-locking bolt required the shooter to cock the firing pin on closing rather than opening, which felt more intuitive during rapid fire. When you opened the bolt, the spent casing ejected smoothly without the resistance of compressing a mainspring. You focused entirely on getting the next round chambered. This system, combined with relentless training, transformed individual soldiers into devastating fire platforms. The rifle's balance point sat naturally in the hands. At just over 9 pounds loaded, it was light enough for extended carrying but heavy enough to absorb recoil and stay on target. The stock design, with its distinctive nose cap and brass butt plate, distributed recoil across the shoulder rather than concentrating it at a single point. Now, let's look at the Mauser 98 action. It's often called the most successful bolt-action rifle design in history, and for good reason. Paul Mauser's 1898 design became the template that dozens of countries copied or adapted. Its controlled feed extractor gripped the cartridge rim as soon as the round left the magazine, guiding it smoothly into the chamber. The dual front-locking lugs positioned right at the chamber gave maximum support exactly where pressures peaked during firing. The 3-position safety allowed the bolt to be opened with the safety engaged for unloading. On paper and on the range, the Mauser represented the pinnacle of bolt-action engineering. German soldiers were trained to be marksmen, and their weapon reflected that emphasis on precision. At 600 yards, a skilled German rifleman with a K98 would consistently outshoot a British soldier with an SMLE. The Mauser's longer barrel, 23.6 inches compared to the SMLE's 25.2 inches, gave it superior muzzle velocity and flatter trajectory at range. German snipers loved the K98K for this reason. But wars aren't won at 600 yards on a known distance range. Combat studies from both world wars consistently showed that most soldiers couldn't effectively use their weapons' maximum accurate range under battlefield stress. The noise, confusion, fear and physical exhaustion of combat degraded marksmanship far more than any inherent accuracy limitation of the weapon. The SMLE was accurate enough for the ranges where fighting actually happened, and its faster operation mattered more than precision most soldiers couldn't achieve anyway. The Mauser's strength was also its limitation. Those tight tolerances that guaranteed precision made the action less forgiving. The controlled feed system, whilst theoretically superior for reliability, required the bolt to travel through a longer, more complex path. You had to lift the bolt handle a full 90 degrees, pull straight back for a considerable distance, push the new round forward whilst ensuring it engaged the extractor properly, then rotate the handle back down. Each movement had to be deliberate and complete. Rush it and you'd get a failure to feed or a double feed. Under stress, when your hands were cold or shaking, when you needed to get rounds down range immediately, that complexity became a handicap. German military doctrine emphasized deliberate aimed fire. Their training manuals stressed breath control, trigger squeeze, proper sight picture. A German soldier was expected to make every shot count, particularly at longer ranges where the Mauser's superior accuracy showed itself. This philosophy made sense in the context of late 19th century warfare, where engagements happened at longer distances and ammunition supply was a constant concern. But by 1940 and certainly by 1939, infantry combat had changed. Automatic weapons provided sustained fire. Artillery dominated the battlefield. The infantryman's role was increasingly about rapid response at closer ranges, exactly where the SMLE's advantages emerged. British soldiers had a rifle designed for battlefield practicality. Start with magazine capacity. The Lee-Enfield held 10 rounds in a detachable box magazine. The Mauser K98 held 5 rounds in an internal magazine fed from stripper clips. That 2-to-1 advantage fundamentally changed how soldiers fought. When a British section opened fire, they could sustain that fire twice as long before needing to reload. When they did reload, swapping magazines took roughly 3 seconds with practiced motion. Drop the empty, insert a fresh one, chamber a round. A German soldier reloading his Mauser had to open the bolt, position a 5-round stripper clip in the guide, push the cartridges down with thumb pressure until they fed into the magazine, extract the empty clip, then chamber the first round. Even a well-trained soldier needed 6 to 8 seconds, and that's assuming the clip fed smoothly without jamming. The mathematics of small unit combat made this capacity difference multiply across an engagement. A standard British infantry section consisted of 10 men. In a sustained firefight with all rifles firing, that section could deliver 100 rounds before anyone needed to reload. A comparable German squad of 10 men could deliver 50 rounds. If the engagement lasted 2 minutes and both sides maintained their trained rates of fire, the British section put roughly 300 rounds down range whilst the German squad managed around 200 to 240. This wasn't just about ammunition expenditure, it was about maintaining continuous fire. Whilst German soldiers were reloading, British soldiers were still shooting. That sustained pressure kept enemy troops suppressed, prevented them from maneuvering, and created opportunities for flanking or advancing. The difference in rate of fire was even more striking. A trained German soldier could fire approximately 10 to 12 aimed rounds per minute with the K98. This was respectable, better than most other armies equipped with similar rifles, but it was half the SMLE's standard. In a firefight lasting 2 minutes, a British soldier could put 30 rounds down range whilst his German counterpart managed 24 at best. Those extra 6 rounds represented potential casualties inflicted or suppression fire that kept enemy heads down. Multiply that across a platoon and the difference became decisive. German small unit tactics had to rely more heavily on their excellent MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns to provide the volume of fire that British sections could generate with rifles alone. The detachable magazine system gave British soldiers tactical flexibility that internal magazines couldn't match. You could carry loaded magazines in pouches on your webbing, ready for instant use. Standard British battle order included 2 pouches holding 5 10-round magazines, each 50 rounds in easily accessible magazines, plus another 50 loose rounds in bandoliers for refilling magazines during lulls in fighting. This meant a soldier could fire 50 aimed rounds in under 4 minutes, without needing to fumble with loose cartridges. German soldiers carried their ammunition in pouches designed for stripper clips, which was efficient for the Mauser's design, but meant every reload required manipulating small metal clips under stress. Drop a clip in the mud or grass, and those 5 rounds became difficult to recover and use. The magazine cutoff feature added another layer of practicality. By engaging the cutoff, you converted the SMLE into a single-shot rifle whilst keeping your magazine fully loaded in reserve. This made sense in scenarios where ammunition conservation mattered, but you might suddenly need rapid fire. You could pick off targets individually, feeding single rounds through the action, then instantly release the cutoff and have 10 rounds available if the situation escalated. The Mauser had no equivalent feature. Trench warfare was a gun designer's nightmare. Everything that looked elegant in a factory testing facility became a liability when subjected to the reality of the Western Front. Rifles spent days and weeks exposed to rain, snow, and the unique corrosive mud of Flanders, a clay-heavy soup that worked its way into every crevice. Soldiers couldn't maintain their weapons like peacetime manuals suggested. There was no heated armory, no clean workspace, no luxury of proper cleaning supplies. You got what moisture you could shake off, maybe a rag if you were lucky, and whatever oil hadn't been used up weeks ago. In these conditions, the Lee-Enfield thrived. Whilst more advanced rifles failed, the secret was in its looseness. British manufacturing tolerances were deliberately less precise than German standards. Parts had more play, more clearance between moving surfaces. To a precision-minded engineer, this looked like inferior craftsmanship. To a soldier in a trench, it meant the difference between a rifle that worked and a rifle that became a club. When mud or ice got into the action, the Lee-Enfield's generous clearances let it cycle anyway. The bolt might feel gritty and rough, but it still moved. The Mauser 98K, with its tighter tolerances and front-locking lugs positioned right where debris accumulated near the chamber, would bind and jam. German soldiers found themselves frantically trying to clear their actions whilst British troops kept firing. The on-closing mechanism provided another survival advantage because the mainspring only compressed when you closed the bolt. Opening it required less force. If your action started binding from dirt or corrosion, you could still muscle the bolt open to clear a jam or eject a stuck case. The Mauser's on-opening design meant you fought against mainspring pressure whilst simultaneously trying to break loose fouled lugs. In freezing conditions, when metal contracted and any moisture became ice, this difference became critical. British troops in the winter of 1917 reported their rifles still functioning when German prisoners' weapons had frozen solid. The prisoners hadn't maintained their rifles any worse. They simply had less forgiving machines. Water resistance wasn't accidental. The SMLE's magazine design featured a cutoff that let you use the rifle as a single-shot weapon whilst keeping your magazine in reserve. More importantly, the magazine well had drainage. Water that got inside could flow out rather than pooling around cartridges and causing corrosion or feeding malfunctions. The Mauser's internal magazine, fed from stripper clips, had no such drainage. Water that entered the action stayed there, mixing with gun oil and powder residue to form a corroding paste. British armourers salvaging German weapons after major offensives noted that captured Mausers often had rust and corrosion in the magazine well, even when the external metal looked fine. The rifle's wood furniture contributed to reliability in ways that seemed counterintuitive. The SMLE's stock was made from walnut, usually Indian walnut, which was relatively soft and absorbed impact without cracking. When soldiers used their rifles as hammering tools to drive trench stakes, open ammunition crates, or break ice, The Lee-Enfield stock survived abuse that would shatter the harder beechwood commonly used in Mauser stocks. A cracked stock wasn't just cosmetic damage, it affected accuracy, and if severe enough, could make the rifle dangerous to fire. British ordnance reports from the Somme offensive noted that Lee-Enfields returned for repair had far fewer catastrophic stock failures than captured German rifles subjected to similar use. The North African desert tested weapons in ways European battlefields never could. Sand worked into every mechanism with the persistence of water. Temperature swings from freezing nights to 120-degree days expanded and contracted metal parts. The moisture from coastal regions combined with sand to create an abrasive paste that could wear down moving parts in weeks. British forces fighting across Libya, Egypt and Tunisia, from 1940 to 1943, found the SMLE handled these conditions better than virtually any other rifle in theater. German troops respected the Mauser's precision, but their field manuals included extensive sections on desert maintenance, special procedures required to keep the K98 functioning. British manuals simply said to shake out the sand and keep firing. The loose tolerances that engineers criticized became salvation in the desert. Sand that would jam a Mauser's tighter actions simply fell through the Lee-Enfield's more generous clearances. Australian and New Zealand troops at Tobruk fought through sandstorms that reduced visibility to arm's length. When the sand cleared, their rifles still worked. The Italian Carcano rifles used by opposing forces frequently seized completely after sandstorms, requiring full disassembly. Even the Mauser needed significant cleaning before reliable function returned. British armourers' reports from the siege of Tobruk noted that Lee-Enfields came back for repair with sand literally caked inside the action, yet most still functioned well enough for combat. One report from August 1941 documented a rifle that had fired over 200 rounds during a 3-day engagement without cleaning, and was still operational when finally inspected. Burma and the Pacific Theatre brought opposite extremes: torrential monsoon rains, jungle humidity that kept metal perpetually damp, and mud that made Flanders look dry by comparison. The British 14th Army fighting in Burma from 1942 to 1945 operated in conditions where metal rusted overnight and wooden stock swelled from moisture absorption. Japanese Arisaka rifles, well-designed weapons in their own right, suffered from humidity affecting their chrome-lined bores and causing feeding issues. The SMLE's unlined bore required more frequent cleaning, but proved less prone to the pitting and corrosion that plagued chrome barrels when the plating failed. The walnut stocks absorbed moisture without the dramatic swelling that affected the denser woods used in Japanese and some German rifles. British troops operating in the Arakan and along the Chindwin River often went weeks without proper weapon maintenance facilities. Sergeant Charles Carfrae of the Border Regiment described his rifle after 3 weeks of continuous jungle operations in early 1944. The metal was spotted with surface rust, the stock had turned nearly black from moisture and handling, and the barrel was fouled from hundreds of rounds without proper cleaning. Yet when his unit engaged Japanese positions at the Ngikadok Pass, the rifle functioned perfectly. Carfrae wrote that he'd seen captured Japanese rifles in far better cosmetic condition that wouldn't cycle reliably because moisture had affected their tighter actions and caused feeding problems. Private Harold Bolton of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment wrote home in October 1914 describing a curious incident after the First Battle of Ypres. His section had overrun a German position and found several abandoned Mauser rifles in excellent condition. The men examined them with professional interest. These were, after all, the weapons that German propaganda claimed were superior to anything the British carried. Bolton's sergeant, a career soldier with 12 years' service, worked the Mauser's action, sighted down the barrel, and handed it back with a simple comment. "Fine weapon for a Sunday shoot. I'll keep me Lee-Enfield for killing Germans, thanks." The captured rifles were turned over to headquarters. Every man in that section kept his SMLE. This pattern repeated itself throughout both world wars. After major engagements, British and Commonwealth troops had opportunities to acquire German weapons. Some kept them as souvenirs. Some used captured ammunition when their own supplies ran low. But when given a genuine choice, soldiers overwhelmingly preferred their Lee-Enfields. Corporal Jack Thomas, who fought in North Africa with the 8th Army, kept a diary that survived the war. In an entry from January 1943, after the fighting around the Marath line, he described his platoon stripping a German supply dump. They took ammunition, food, even a few MP-40 submachine guns, but the captured K98 rifles were left behind. Thomas wrote, "The lads won't trade their rifles. Jerry's looks smart, but ours shoots faster, and that's what counts when they're running at you." Lieutenant William Douglas Home, who served with the Royal Armoured Corps, recorded his observations in letters that were later published. After interrogating German prisoners in Normandy during July 1944, he noted their respect for British marksmanship and rate of fire. One German sergeant told him through a translator that his squad had been convinced they were facing automatic weapons during an engagement near Caen. When Douglas Home explained it was bolt-action rifles, the sergeant didn't believe him initially. He'd counted the incoming fire, and insisted no bolt-action rifle could sustain that volume. Douglas Home brought out an SMLE, and demonstrated the Mad Minute technique. The sergeant's expression, Douglas Home wrote, was a mixture of respect and profound annoyance at having been beaten by what he'd considered obsolete equipment. The perspectives weren't purely British. Indian Army troops, who made up a substantial portion of Commonwealth forces, were equally devoted to the rifle they called the 303, after its caliber. Sepoy Gian Singh of the 4th Indian Division wrote in Punjabi to his family, describing the East African campaign against Italian forces in 1941. His unit captured Italian Carcano rifles and German Mausers being used by colonial troops. Singh described trying a Mauser, and finding it too slow for battle, good only for careful shooting. The Indian Army had been using Lee-Enfields since 1905, and soldiers from the northwest frontier to Burma consistently praised its reliability and speed. Indian troops fought in some of the war's harshest conditions: desert heat, monsoon humidity, mountain cold, and their testimonies repeatedly emphasized that the SMLE functioned when other rifles failed. At the Battle of Kohima, in 1944, Indian and British troops held a position so small that the front line ran through a tennis court. Fighting happened at ranges measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. The Lee-Enfield's rapid fire and reliable function in monsoon conditions proved decisive. Japanese Arizaka rifles, whilst excellent weapons in dry conditions, suffered feeding failures in the constant dampness. Indian soldiers reported that their Lee-Enfields, despite being covered in rust and mud, continued to function throughout the siege. Australian soldiers were notoriously pragmatic about equipment. If something worked better, they used it regardless of regulations. Sergeant Bill Griffiths, who fought at Tobruk and El Alamein with the 9th Australian Division, kept notes that formed the basis of a post-war memoir. He described captured German equipment being evaluated constantly. Australian troops happily adopted German stick grenades, which they found superior to British Mills bombs for certain tasks. They scavenged German optics and machine guns. But Griffiths noted that in all his time in North Africa, and later in the Pacific, he never saw an Australian soldier voluntarily replace his Lee-Enfield with a captured rifle. The attitude, he wrote, was simple: the bloody thing works, shoots straight enough and shoots fast. Why would you change? New Zealand troops serving in the Mediterranean and Pacific theatres echoed these sentiments. Lance Corporal Roy Henderson of the 2nd New Zealand Division described an incident in Italy where his section captured a German position that included a cache of pristine K98 rifles and several thousand rounds of ammunition. The New Zealanders took the ammunition. 303 and 8 mm Mauser rounds weren't interchangeable, but ammunition was ammunition and could be traded. The rifles were left stacked against a wall. Henderson wrote to his brother, "German rifles are beautifully made, I'll give them that. But they're slow to load, and they jam if you look at them wrong. Our old .303s might not win beauty contests, but they get the job done." The British Army had a training standard that seemed impossible the first time recruits heard about it. Every soldier was expected to fire 15 aimed rounds per minute from bolt-action Lee-Enfield. The truly skilled could push that to 30 rounds. This was called the Mad Minute, and it wasn't some peacetime showboating exercise. It was a fundamental tactical doctrine that would save the British Expeditionary Force in the opening months of the First World War. British musketry training was arguably the most intensive in the world. Recruits spent weeks at rifle ranges before they ever saw other aspects of combat training. The process began with dry firing exercises, learning bolt manipulation and trigger control without live ammunition. Instructors drilled recruits relentlessly on the proper sequence: bolt up, pull back, eject the spent case, chamber a new round, bolt forward, bolt down, acquire target, controlled breathing, trigger squeeze. They learned to fire from standing, kneeling, sitting, and prone positions. They practiced rapid magazine changes until they could swap a fresh 10-round magazine in under 3 seconds. The motion became automatic release catch with trigger finger, drop empty magazine, grab fresh magazine from pouch, insert at an angle, press home until you heard the click, slap the bolt handle to ensure it was fully closed, acquire target. They trained to estimate range by eye and adjust their sights accordingly. The SMLE's ladder sight system, whilst looking archaic compared to German designs, was actually faster to adjust under stress. You flipped a lever, slid the sight to the range marking you needed, and locked it down. No fine adjustments, no overthinking, just combat practical speed. German Mauser sights, whilst more precise, required more careful adjustment that was difficult under combat stress. The training went beyond mere mechanics. Instructors emphasized breath control: take a breath, let half out, squeeze the trigger at the natural respiratory pause. They taught trigger discipline: smooth, steady pressure, not a jerk. They drilled sight picture: focus on the front sight, let the target blur slightly, align the tip of the front post with the center of mass. The Mad Minute qualification required hitting a 12-inch target at 300 yards 15 times in 60 seconds. That meant you had to load a fresh magazine mid-drill whilst maintaining accuracy. Soldiers who could manage 20 hits earned marksman status. The truly exceptional could achieve 25 or more. The legendary sergeant instructor Snoxall reportedly achieved 38 hits in 1 minute during a 1914 demonstration at Hythe School of Musketry, though this required an assistant feeding him loaded magazines. The record wasn't just about speed. Every round had to hit a 12-inch circle at 300 yards. Miss the target, and it didn't count. The point wasn't to break records. It was to ingrain muscle memory so deep that rapid accurate fire became automatic under the stress and chaos of battle. When bullets were snapping past your head, when artillery was falling nearby, when everything was noise and smoke and fear, you didn't think about the mechanics of reloading. Your hands simply did it. On the 23rd of August 1914, at the Belgian town of Mons, roughly 70,000 British soldiers faced nearly 160,000 German troops. The Germans expected a quick victory against what they assumed was a small, outdated force. Instead, they ran into a wall of rifle fire so intense that German commanders believed they were facing massed machine guns. They weren't. They were facing British riflemen doing exactly what they'd been trained to do. At Mons, German troops advancing in formation were cut down at ranges where they couldn't effectively return fire. After-action reports describe entire German companies being stopped cold by what they genuinely believed was sustained machine gun fire from multiple positions. In reality, sections of 8 to 10 British riflemen were producing that volume of fire. A German lieutenant captured later that week told interrogators he'd counted the rate of fire and estimated his unit was facing at least 20 machine guns. He couldn't comprehend that bolt-action rifles could generate such firepower. The British had just 4 machine guns per battalion at Mons. The rest was rifles, training, and the SMLE's rapid-fire capability doing exactly what it was designed to do. This legacy carried forward into the Second World War. Training standards remained the same. Every British infantryman still trained for the Mad Minute. The soldiers who hit Normandy beaches in 1944 carried the same basic rifle and techniques their grandfathers had used at Mons 30 years before. The training regimen at British infantry depots in 1944 looked remarkably similar to that of 1914. Recruits still spent weeks perfecting their marksmanship before moving on to other infantry skills. The Mad Minute still formed the cornerstone of weapons training. Behind this training philosophy lay a practical reality about modern warfare. The economic lesson of the Lee-Enfield is perhaps its most relevant. Britain produced roughly 17 million Lee-Enfields across all variants from 1895 to the 1950s. This staggering number wasn't accidental. It was the result of deliberate design choices that prioritized manufacturability. The manufacturing process used simpler tooling and less precise machining than the Mauser required. Where the Mauser demanded tight tolerances and skilled machinists, the Lee-Enfield could be produced more quickly with less specialized equipment. This meant factories could be set up faster, workers trained more quickly, and production costs kept lower. When war broke out in 1939, Britain could rapidly expand Lee-Enfield production. Factories in Fazakali Maltby and Fazakali turned out thousands of rifles weekly. India's Ishapur rifle factory became one of the largest producers, eventually manufacturing over 2 million rifles. Australia's Lithgow small arms factory produced hundreds of thousands more. This distributed production meant that even if one factory was bombed or disrupted, others continued production. Germany's more centralized and complex manufacturing for the Mauser system proved more vulnerable to disruption. Allied bombing campaigns targeting German factories had devastating effects on rifle production. British production spread across the empire and using simpler processes proved more resilient. During the Second World War, when industrial capacity determined how many rifles an army could field, the SMLE's manufacturability became a strategic advantage. Germany produced excellent rifles, but never enough of them. Throughout the war, German forces faced rifle shortages. Units were often under strength in personal weapons, and the Wehrmacht had to supplement with captured rifles from dozens of different nations, creating a logistics nightmare. Britain produced good enough rifles in sufficient quantity to arm not just its own forces, but to provide weapons to resistance movements and allied nations across the globe. Lee-Enfields armed Free French forces, Polish troops, Greek partisans, Yugoslav resistance fighters, and countless other allied formations. After the war, British and Indian-made Lee-Enfields equipped armies across the decolonizing world. The cost differential was significant. A Lee-Enfield cost roughly £3 to produce in 1940, about £180 in today's money. A Mauser K98K cost approximately 70 Reichsmarks, roughly £4 at contemporary exchange rates, but requiring more skilled labor and longer production time. When you're equipping millions of soldiers, those differences in cost and production time multiply into strategic advantages. Adequate weapons in sufficient quantity beats superior weapons in limited numbers. This lesson has repeated throughout military history, but the Lee-Enfield versus Mauser comparison illustrates it perfectly. The Lee-Enfield's service life tells a story that contradicts conventional wisdom about military technology. The rifle entered British service in 1895 as the magazine Lee-Enfield, evolved into the SMLE in 1907, and remained the standard British and Commonwealth infantry weapon through the Second World War. But its story didn't end in 1945. India continued manufacturing Lee-Enfields until the 1980s, producing variants like the 7.62 mm Ishapur 2A and 2A1 for their own forces and for export. The rifle saw combat in Korea, where British and Commonwealth forces used Lee-Enfields against Chinese and North Korean troops armed with Soviet weapons. It fought in Malaya during the emergency from 1948 to 1960, proving its worth in jungle warfare against communist insurgents. During the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, from 1952 to 1960, British forces and Kenyan security forces relied on the Lee-Enfield. The rifle performed well in the varied terrain of East Africa, from humid coastal regions to dry highlands. In 1956, British and French forces carried Lee-Enfields during the Suez Crisis, a brief conflict that nonetheless demonstrated the rifle's continued relevance in mid-20th century warfare. Even in 1982, when British forces retook the Falkland Islands, some support and logistics personnel carried Lee-Enfields, though by then the L1A1 SLR had become the standard infantry rifle. The Lee-Enfield's final military role was perhaps its most remarkable testament to reliability. Canadian Rangers in the Arctic was still issued the No. 4 Mark I variant until 2015, 120 years after the Lee-Enfield design first appeared. The Rangers, who patrol Canada's vast northern territories, chose to keep their Lee-Enfields decades after they'd been replaced elsewhere. The reason: in Arctic conditions, the rifle's simple, robust action proved more reliable than more modern designs. When temperatures drop to -40 degrees and mechanical complexity becomes a liability, the Lee-Enfield's forgiving design remained the sensible choice. No other military bolt-action rifle approaches this service record. The Mauser 98K, despite its technical excellence, was replaced within years of Germany's defeat. The American Springfield 1903, the Japanese Arisaka, the Soviet Mosin Nagant, all were phased out within a generation of the Second World War's end. Only the Lee-Enfield persisted. This longevity wasn't nostalgia or bureaucratic inertia. It was recognition that the rifle got the fundamentals right in ways that mattered more than specifications suggested. The British hadn't set out to build the most accurate rifle, or the most precisely manufactured rifle. They'd built a rifle optimized for what infantry combat actually required: sustained rapid fire, reliability under adverse conditions, and simplicity of operation under stress. These priorities seemed almost pedestrian compared to the Mauser's engineering elegance, but they proved more valuable than precision that most soldiers couldn't exploit. The SMLE represented a philosophy that effectiveness in the field trumped excellence on paper. Modern military small arms development has repeatedly relearned the Lee-Enfield's lessons. The M16 rifle's early failures in Vietnam came partly from tight tolerances that made the weapon jam in jungle conditions, the same problem that plagued the Mauser in mud and sand. The solution involved loosening tolerances and adding chrome lining, essentially applying principles the SMLE had embodied since 1907. The AK-47's legendary reliability comes from generous clearances that let it function when filled with dirt, exactly what made the Lee-Enfield work in trenches 70 years earlier. Contemporary military doctrine emphasizes volume of fire and rapid engagement at shorter ranges rather than long-range precision marksmanship. The same philosophy that led Britain to prioritize the mad minute over 1,000 yard accuracy. The rifle story offers broader lessons about military technology and procurement. Advanced engineering doesn't automatically translate to battlefield superiority. The Mauser was objectively more sophisticated in its design: controlled feed, dual front locking lugs, superior metallurgy. But sophistication creates complexity, and complexity creates failure points. The Lee-Enfield succeeded through simplicity and forgiveness. Its loose tolerances, rear-locking bolts and straightforward manual of arms made it easier to use and harder to break. Soldiers didn't need to be expert gunsmiths to keep it running. This matters because wars are fought by conscripts and reservists, not just career soldiers. A weapon that only performs excellently in expert hands is less valuable than one that performs adequately in anyone's hands. The Lee-Enfield was a democratic weapon. It worked for the career sergeant with 20 years service and the fresh-faced private with 6 weeks training. The Lee-Enfield proved that old doesn't mean obsolete and modern doesn't guarantee better. It proved that understanding how soldiers actually fight matters more than theoretical performance. Most importantly, it proved that the best weapon isn't the one that wins design competitions. It's the one that keeps working when everything else has failed, that soldiers trust with their lives, and that gets them home alive. The British Tommy's preference for his outdated rifle over German modern weapons wasn't stubbornness. It was wisdom born from experience. When your life depends on your rifle functioning in mud, sand, ice, or monsoon rain, you don't want the most precise weapon, you want the most reliable one. When you're facing enemy soldiers at 200 yards, you don't need to hit a 6-inch circle at 800 yards. You need to put rounds down range faster than the other fellow. The Lee-Enfield delivered what mattered. For 120 years, across every continent and in every climate, it kept working. It kept soldiers alive, and in the end, that's the only specification that truly matters.